Hello and welcome back to the Atlas Agency's continuing investigation of the Path to Carcosa cycle for Arkham Horror the card game. I'm your host Brandon, and this video is my player card rundown for Mythos Pack number 2, Echoes of the Past. There are 14 new player cards in this expansion, and in this player card rundown I'll be showing off each of those cards and giving my impressions. This particular pack is one that's dominated by two different suites of related cards, the 4 Desperate Skills and the 5 Composure assets. But each class also gets one card that's not part of one of those suites, and so that's where I'm going to start talking through those 5 one-off cards. Our first card is the Guardian Event Heroic Rescue. This is a level 0 event that costs 1 resource. It's fast, and you play it when a non-elite enemy would attack another investigator at your location. You engage that enemy and resolve its attack against you instead, then you deal it 1 damage. Seems like Carcosa is laying the foundation for a more tanking-focused style of Guardian Investigator, one that's geared towards absorbing damage and even taking hits for other players. In the deluxe box we got the card True Grit, we also got Mark Harrigan, who benefits when he takes damage, and William Yorick, who has Guardian as a secondary class and who can replay assets with health and sanity from his discard pile, which really adds to his ability to absorb hits. I don't think every Guardian deck is going to want Heroic Rescue, but it does seem like it's a good fit for those tanks. Extra damage, especially damage that doesn't require a test, is always useful. It's also nice that this can let you engage an enemy off of another player on their turn. The other player just has to do something that triggers an attack of opportunity, then you play this to redirect the attack to you, and the other player is free to go about their business. The fast engage card Taunt from last cycle could only be played on your turn. So that's a nice edge for Heroic Rescue. Just gives you a little more flexibility in how you plan your turns when there are enemies that you have to deal with. This could potentially save you 2 actions dealing with an enemy, one for the engage and potentially another if the bonus damage saves you from having to make another attack. So I think for some decks this is worth consideration. Seekers pick up Anatomical Diagrams. This is a 1 resource event that's fast. You play it during any investigator's turn, but only if you have 5 or more remaining sanity on your investigator. Choose a non-elite enemy at your location. Until the end of the active investigator's turn, that enemy gets -2 fight and -2 evade. I'm not really sold on this one. I think the cards you want to compare this with are Mind Over Matter from the core and Exposed Weakness from the Dunwich cycle. Mind Over Matter is another 1 resource fast event that lets you use your intellect in place of your combat and agility for a round. If you're a seeker, good chance your intellect is going to be at least 2 higher than your combat and probably your agility too. So unless Anatomical reduces an enemy to 0 fight, where you're only going to fail on an auto-fail token, feels like it's sort of a comparable boost to your chances to fight and evade. Now Anatomical does let you spread the benefit to another investigator, which Mind Over Matter can't do, but it still only lasts for that 1 investigator's turn. And Mind Over Matter's benefit applies with more than 1 enemy and also doesn't care whether they're elite or not. I think the elite thing is kind of a big restriction. A lot of the enemies you're going to want to go to this level of effort on are going to be elite. So weighing those differences, I think Mind Over Matter comes out ahead. The other card, Exposed Weakness, reduces the fight, but only for 1 attack against it, and it also requires you to pass a test first. I haven't ended up using Exposed Weakness too much, and it is level 1, so it costs experience, but for me it's still ahead of Anatomical Diagrams. I think the fact that Exposed Weakness can hit elites is a large part of that. So Anatomical Diagrams gets a thumbs down from me for now. I guess though if you only have 1 core, it might substitute for not having a second Mind Over Matter, so you could run 1 Mind Over Matter and 1 copy of this. Mystics get a new ally, David Renfield. His subtitle is Esteemed Eschatologist, eschatology being the study of the end times and the final destiny of humanity. He costs 2 resources and has 2 health and 1 sanity. He is our first mystic to have more than 1 health, though it's a pretty small field. He's actually only the 3rd mystic ally. I was kind of surprised to see how few of those we'd had. He has the new patron trait, and like both of the other mystic allies, David uses doom tokens. While he has at least 1 doom on him, you get +1 willpower. He also has an ability that lets you exhaust him to place 1 doom on him, then you gain 1 resource for each doom that's on him. I think if you have an agenda with a long clock and a reliable way to kill David when the time comes, which could be as simple as a horror from a forbidden knowledge, then you should be able to get a worthwhile amount of resources out of him. I wonder whether it would be worth having Safina Rousseau use Adaptable to swap David in and out over a campaign based on the agenda makeup or the agenda length of the next scenario. The idea I saw that I like best, though, is using him with readying effects like Ashcan Pete, where you can ready him and use him again in the same turn to really start getting the funds flowing quickly out of him. We know we're getting at least one more readying effect this cycle, Inspiring Presence in pack number 4. I think David has the potential to be a fun combo piece alongside those readying cards. Survivors pick up Cherished Keepsake. This is a zero-cost asset that occupies your accessory slot. There's no game text on it. It simply has 2 sanity, so it's basically a counterpart to the core set Survivor card Leather Coat, which just had 2 health. So it's a pretty simple card. I think in most decks this is probably not going to be worth the deck space, especially since Survivors already have the Peter Sylvester ally, who's fantastic at taking horror. If there is a place for it, though, it's probably in William York decks. Since it costs 0, it's free for him to play it from his discard pile when he's using his ability. That lets him absorb a lot of extra horror, and he can still keep his ally slot open for some of the great Guardian allies like Beat Cop. The flavor text on this one tells us that the card is depicting Mr. Potterson, who is a teddy bear belonging to Wendy Adams. At first I thought the 2 sanity on this card lined up with the 2 horror that's dealt by Wendy's signature weakness, Abandoned and Alone, so she could cope with her abandonment by squeezing the stuffing out of this bear. That would have been a nice touch, but unfortunately Abandoned and Alone deals direct horror, so that doesn't work. The last one-off card we have in this pack is Knuckle Duster. This is a one-handed illicit melee weapon that costs 2 resources. Has a fight action you can use that gives you +1 damage for your attack, but it gives the enemy a retaliate, so if you miss with it, then the enemy you were aiming for is going to make a counterattack against you. I really don't see much reason to use this card at the moment. It seems like it's the worst card in this pack. It just asks you to assume a lot of extra risk and really doesn't give you much back in return. It still occupies a hand slot, it still costs 2 resources, which is only 1 less than Machete, and it doesn't give you any skill bonus. Anyone who could use Knuckle Duster either already has access to better weapons, or they have such a low combat skill that it'd be suicide to try to use this. Skids has the Guardian weapons, Safina has spells, and only 2 combat anyway. Jenny can splash a Guardian weapon, and if Wendy tries to use this, she's just going to break her delicate little hands. Now, you can evade the enemy first to stop it from retaliating, but you would still probably be failing to succeed at attacks often enough to cancel out that damage boost, so you're not really gaining any efficiency. The only thing I can think of that would justify using this card would be if we had some kind of card that gave you a benefit for when an enemy retaliated against you. We don't have that yet, and until we get something like that, I think this is just going to be collecting dust. That's it for the one-off cards. There are 2 suites of cards that make up the remaining 9 cards of the pack, the Desperate Skills and the Composure Assets. We'll hit the Desperate Skills first. Each of these, like Run for Your Life here, is a level 0 skill card with 4 icons that can only be committed to a test if you have 3 or fewer remaining sanity. Each also has max of 1 committed per test, and Echoes has 1 of these for each of the 4 skills. Run for Your Life here is the agility one. For willpower, there's Say Your Prayers, and I like the artwork on that one especially. Desperate Search covers intellect. This guy is trying to remember whether it was in the Learn to Play guide or the Rules Reference guide. And finally, there's Reckless Assault for combat. Just reading around, it seems like people have been generally negative towards these. I think I'm a little more optimistic. You definitely need to pick the right situation for them, though. High sanity investigators probably are never going to want to use these, and if you're playing a lower difficulty setting, the extra pips may be overkill. You may be better off in the lower difficulties with one of the 2 pip skills from the core set that lets you draw a card. But if you're playing a low sanity investigator like Roland, I think that these could be viable. The 3 or fewer sanity is just on your investigator. You can have sanity on your allies or your other assets, so you don't necessarily have to be knocking on death's door to be able to use these. I also think that the campaign you're playing is going to matter too. These dovetail with themes that we've seen in the Carcosa campaign so far, and I think that they'll have extra relevancy or potency if you're playing Carcosa. The other suite is the Composure Assets, which I think are really the highlight of this particular pack. There's 1 of these for each of the 5 classes. Each Composure is a level 1 asset with Fast that costs 1 resource. Each investigator is limited to having only 1 of these Composures in play at a time. These have abilities that let you pay resources at a 1-to-1 ratio to boost tests for certain skills. and each composure affects a different set of skills. With one exception, they generally each work on 2 skills each. That's a familiar setup. We've seen that pattern in both the core set as well as in the Blood on the Altar permanents. Aside from the skill pumps, each composure has 1 sanity, as well as a restriction that says that non-direct horror has to be assigned to the composure before it can be assigned to your investigator card. So if you take a horror, your composure is shattered and you lose the card. I think that's a pretty cool theme. Note that they only block you from assigning horror to your investigator though, so if you have other assets with sanity, like cherished, keepsake, then you can assign horror to those and keep your composure intact. In general, I really like these cards. Let's walk through each of them individually. Guardians get combat training, which can boost combat and agility. I'm actually not a huge fan of this particular combination, especially for Guardians. Combat is great, but I'm usually not as interested in agility for them. Seekers get scientific theory, which does combat and intellect. Those are kind of the core skills of the game, so I really like that pairing. I think this one is actually a great match for Roland Banks, better than combat training. Survivors get Plucky, which does intellect and willpower. I just played a few games with this one actually, and I really liked it. I was playing the back half of Dunwich, and there's an aspect of where doom awaits that's sometimes challenging for survivor investigators. This card proved really helpful in that scenario. One nice thing is that Plucky syncs up with Survivor's permanent talent, Scrapper, to give you coverage of all 4 skills. That's really handy. You get combat and agility from Scrapper, and then willpower and intellect from this. Really glad to have this one. The Mystic Composure breaks the mold a little bit in that it doesn't do specific skills. Grounded instead can boost any skill test that stems from a spell card. Right now, all of those happen to be willpower tests, so this is actually weaker than any of the other composures. I guess it does, though, kind of foreshadow that we might get spells that use other stats, so maybe that's something we'll see before the end of the Carcosa cycle. The last composure, and also the last card in the pack, is Moxie for Rogues. This one does willpower and agility. I think this is another good one. I really want to try this in Safina. In my plays, she seemed to be fairly resource rich a lot of the time, with money to spare for these skill boosts. So I think the willpower part of this one will really help her use her spells effectively, which has kind of been an issue before with her willpower of 4 and not 5. Could also be a good help for Skids, who tends to have willpower issues as well. I'm a little concerned by Moxie's artwork, though. If you look, the guy is carrying a little Yorkie dog, and I guess it could be rightfully his, but the way he's sneaking off the train, to me it looks like maybe he's just engaged in some dog napping. I know that we've maybe become a little desensitized when it comes to going through other people's stuff on trains, but this seems rough. I think this may also trigger some issues that I have that are stemming from a particularly bad playthrough of Blood on the Altar. And also, the guy sort of looks like Joey Vigil to me, so now I can't help but think that that pile of cash that he's counting in the art on his card is some kind of dog ransom money. Anyway, that's Moxie, and again, we're at the end of the pack. Overall, I think it's fair to say that Echoes is a little bit of a weaker pack on the player card front. I do think, though, that the composures are really nice to have, and a lot of different investigators are going to benefit from those, so they have a nice broad appeal. Outside of the composures, though, while some of the other cards are okay or useful in certain situations, there's nothing that's really outstanding in this pack. So that'll wrap us up. As always, thanks for watching the Atlas Agency, and good luck in your own investigations.